All right. So, one admission I want to start off with making here is that these past few months have flown by in a flurry because it's been really busy. I don't know how it's been for your experience, but I know for myself, for a number of the people who are just kind of, it's like we're constantly feeling in a bit of a triage mode, always trying to pick up pieces and like, oh, that got missed and we missed this. And it's been flying by because now we're at the end of March, spring break. I don't know if you noticed that somebody forgot to tell the trees as well. They aren't like they're just starting to bloom. They're a bit behind on the game. But one thing I noticed is we're right in the middle of this season called Lent right now. And what that is for 40 days, counting up to Easter weekend when we celebrate and reflect on the sacrifice that Jesus made and rose from the grave, we kind of take this posture of looking and like a countdown looking towards that. It's like Advent season for Christmas. But a part of that often involves some self-denial or abstaining from something, whether it's a habit or whether it's a practice or food or something like that, and you fast from it with the intention that normally what you do if you're always scrolling Instagram, you cut that out of your life for a bit, and then you take that time to focus on Jesus in devotions, in the Word. And so I wondered, does anybody do that practice here? Does anybody kind of make a practice of counting down through Lent? It's not a thing we've talked about at this church too often, but I know for me, one of the things that I should have done is try to cut off Amazon. I like shopping a bit too much. I know I could hear my dad chuckle, but all the packages that come up and to the door, but he often is telling me to order stuff for him too, so it's not just me. I like shopping. And not just like, I don't like the thrill of buying stuff. I really like being thrifty, finding, oh, here's this creative solution and here's like a really good deal and I found this used thing and I can just buy this part. But it definitely becomes a bit of, the rabbit trail goes down so we've got some really old cars that need a lot of TLC. So I'm like, hey, I need this car part, but then it could look good if it was in that color. And then I find these things that also work really well and then the dice off the mirror and suddenly I'm asking my wife if I could buy a new mountain bike. And these things, it just happens, right? But it takes up a lot of my time. But I do have one story about shopping. It's actually one of my worst shopping stories. Not me, really. It's a bad experience of shopping. So, I think I'm pretty good at it. I'm thrifty. I can kind of go into most different types of stores for whatever it is. But one time, I found myself in need of some textiles, some fabrics. And so this is not my area of expertise. It would be my wife's a little bit more. So she said, okay, you probably need some cloth that's like this for the project, and you could probably find it at this place, and you can head out. So I head downtown, and I go to find this place. I won't say it because this is not a good review of this store I went to, but I went to this textile store, and man, Leslie prepped me with some terminology to use and stuff, and I went in, and I instantly was out of place. Like, I think I was wearing some of my old construction gear still. I was working on a project at the house. And I didn't have the look, I didn't know the terms, I didn't know where to go. I may as well have been like a vegan in a butcher shop wearing like an Out Loud t-shirt. I stuck out like a sore thumb. But what was worse was I kind of was made to feel that way. So I'm flipping through trying to find the stuff, I didn't know where to go. And so the store clerk comes up and even more than just can I help you? What are you looking for? I'm trying to find this thing, it's not there. Oh, okay. Could you help me find with it? Well, you should know where it is. I've never been here before. Oh, okay, so you're not one of us. You have no clue. I was just brushed off, right? I even got to the point where you don't touch that stuff that way. You'll ruin the nap and the velvet. And so constantly I kind of found something I liked. But even to the point of when I went to go pay, I got reprimanded for I tried doing the tap thing with my phone, right? Because it's 2014 at this point. But we do not do that here. So I was cut out of that place. It was not a good, I won't go back there again, but I knew I did not belong there. I was made to feel like I didn't belong there, and it didn't feel fair because I didn't have any experience. I didn't know. I was eager, and I was willing, and I tried to be open-minded, but man, it did not go over well. And I wonder if any of you have had an experience like that, maybe not shopping, maybe with a family gathering, or you went to maybe an in-law sort of thing, or a place of work. Maybe it was an event you went to and you just you knew you weren't on the in crowd. right? Maybe you've been complicit in actually making somebody feel like they didn't belong in a situation. This can be something that's present in small ways in our life constantly, like a shopping experience, right? Or something at work. But there's actually an even bigger narrative that's gone on throughout history, massively important to the text we're talking about this morning in Galatians. Whether you believe it or not, or you're religious or not, there's this huge dialogue of if you're in or out that actually affects all of us. And this idea of if you are one of God's people, if you're chosen, or if you're accepted, if you're in with God, whatever name you give God in that point. And that's a story that the Jewish people in the Bible that most of the Old Testament was talking about, a lot of the New Testament was talking to Jewish people who accepted Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of all of that, whether they were in or out. So let's dive into the text. We're in Galatians chapter 3. And last week, Chad started us off in Galatians chapter 3, did a fantastic job of outlining what the Apostle Paul, the author of this book, who was a man who was striving after trying to kill people who followed Jesus. Jesus came into his life, changed his whole life upside down radically, and set this tone where he's now talking to Christians in early Galatia, like kind of East Mediterranean area, modern-day Turkey. And so Paul had set up, the author of this had set up some churches there, and now he's writing letters back to kind of correct some issues that have been going on. And this is the part in the letter, if you remember from last week, even too, where chapter 3, Galatians chapter 3, starts off heated. He calls them out. He calls them foolish, which actually had like implications of a death threat in there. This is a big deal. Like, this is the all caps section of the email that Paul is sending that you need to pay attention to, that has massive real like implications that should be a little bit offensive and a little bit challenging. It's easy to read this book 2,000 years later thinking it's just fine and easy going. You can memorize this stuff and put it in our back pocket. But where we're actually going to pick up here, Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, right away he starts talking about this idea of being in or out of God's family, of God's people. So Galatians chapter 3, verse 7, Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians and to us, "Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham." It's a small, simple statement with a huge story. So Abraham. I thought we were talking about God, but now we're talking about Abraham. Abraham, let's get some backstory. Let's get some context. So this comes from the very beginning, one of the first book in the Bible, Genesis, talking about the creation story and the origin of how God started to interact with people. Abraham was a man in ancient Mesopotamia. He was a faithful man who God had reached out to. Abraham responded positively. He was listening to God. He was following his instructions, waiting for God, praying to God constantly. So God chose to work with him. And even got to this point after so many years, and God made this promise to Abraham saying, you're special, and I'm going to bless you, and through you, I'm going to make a multitude of people, and they're going to come to know me. You will be the father of a nation of my people. So through all of history, then, you have people who are trying to say, like, I am a descendant from Abraham, ultimately. Like, I'm in this family. I am part of God's people. Abraham had 2 sons, though, and that's even caused massive divides. So Judaism says I was Abraham's second son, but with his first wife, Sarah, like, I'm one of those kids, so I'm part of the real people. But then Islam has said, no, his first son with the other lady, that we're part of actually that bloodline, and that's the proper one. So now I have, like, I'm in the family, no, I'm not. And then now, thousands and thousands of years later, where even to the churches in Galatia, you have all these Christians who are now saying, actually, but Jesus said we're also part of this too. Like, now we're in this family too. And that didn't feel right for people who had been tracking the lineage and living by the rules and saying I'm in, and we fought wars over this stuff, and you're saying you're just part of the family now? And Paul even reiterates, it says, like, all of those who have faith are children of Abraham. So what is going on here? This is the case for Paul's letter. He's trying to help the Christians in ancient Galatia, help us understand who is worthy of being part of this faith, and how do you have that relationship with Jesus? How do you foster that? And specifically, he's targeting people who are actually, whether intentionally or unintentionally, keeping people from that opportunity, who are keeping people out. See, it felt very unfair that all of a sudden, people who have kept these rules and lived by this code and been part of this family, and they memorized the genealogy for hundreds of generations, suddenly people are allowed to just say they're also part of that family as well, and they can be equal with us. And Paul's saying yes, but they said no. And what started happening was they would impose on them like almost a rite of passage or rituals of saying like, okay, but you got to do these things. You better do this, and there's circumcision, and there's these rules you got to do, and dress this way, and don't do these things on this day, but do things on this day. And even still, you're kind of like not a proper class citizen. What just happened a few verses earlier in this letter to Galatians, it actually has some bigger implications now, where Paul was calling out a man who was saying like he only eats with people who are actually on the in, not the ones who are just like, oh, I'm kind of in, like I'm a Christian, I have faith, but like no. So you got like the children of Abraham sit at this table, the cool kids dinner table, and everyone else, you sit here, right? You're an outsider, different classes. And so Paul's like, this has got to stop. And he's talking about that, and what's wild is that continues to happen. It's a relatable emotion to feel like what is fair and what's unfair and what's justice and everything. There's an even darker thing of what's going on here, though. What Paul actually starts to imply as we go on in this passage is it's not just simply like whether you've got good manners or not and whether you can accept people well or not. He says if you stand in the way, unintentionally or intentionally, keeping people from this family, keeping people from properly being part of this, it can affect your ability to be part of this family. You can disqualify yourself from being part of the family of God. So let's talk about this idea of fair now, because we have to understand this. This is important. See, we always think of fair in our lives as a justice issue. Like, something happened, I deserve something, they deserve something worse, right? You've got to have good to balance out the bad. When something happens bad against you, it has to happen equally to them, an eye for an eye. Like, that's what fair seems. If somebody gets the thing, like, you should get the thing as well. But there's a different idea that happens throughout the Bible. And we're going to actually go into the Gospel of Matthew, a recording of Jesus' actions and life and stories. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, there's this parable. There's a story that Jesus, the words right out of Jesus' mouth, he shared with us to kind of counter this idea of fair. Because we often miss the point of what's actually going on, especially when God is involved. So Jesus tells this story of a man who owned a vineyard, big, massive vineyard that was ready for a harvest. And so he needed to hire some workers for this vineyard to pick all the grapes. And so early in the morning, he found some workers and said, I'll pay you a full day's wage if you just work on the vineyard, harvest, pick the grapes. And got a bunch of workers. They said, that sounds great. That's fair. That's good. And he realized partway through the day, around noon, he needed some more workers. So he found a few more and said, hey, I need some more help. I'll pay you a full day's wage. If you start now, work till the evening. And they said, oh, that's great. Yeah, all right. So they kept going. But then even later on in the afternoon, he needed some more help. So he found a few more workers, the owner of the vineyard, and said, I need some more help. If you can help and work on the vineyard, I'll pay you a full day's wage. And that's great. So everyone was agreed. They worked the full day. Evening came. He started paying it out. And then everyone started thinking, this isn't fair. Wait, they worked a little bit less than I did. I worked for longer hours, right? And if you do fair, it should be like the by the hour thing, and they got the union involved, and there's a strike, and it didn't go well with anybody. That's not what actually happened. But the owner then interrupts. And so the idea here, the owner is representative of God saying, so you all agreed to this. You said it was fine. I paid you a full day's wage. Nobody has gotten ripped off here. But are you jealous because I'm a generous man? I'm more generous than your greedy hearts wanting more than maybe you deserve? That hits hard. Because, see, there's a big story that happens here where especially the people who were initially listening to this letter would have memorized the entire Old Testament, the Torah, and all the stuff the prophet said, and all the laws, and they knew how to keep the laws. They knew how to follow all the rules to a T, or at least knew the rules they were supposed to follow, and how to hide the ones that they didn't follow. But they often miss the point of God actually at work and how God interacted with people when they did or didn't follow the rules. See, in that story, the vineyard owner, being God, is generous, not just strictly focused on, did you do enough of the stuff and your minimum wage and you've got, some experience on this guy's farm. That's not the point. He's actually focused on love and generosity. So let's go back to Abraham, because there's a very scandalous story that happens with Abraham, and maybe you've heard it, maybe you don't. The people who initially heard this letter, when they heard Abraham, they would have known. Like, they knew the life, the genealogy, everything going on with Abraham, the readers of this letter. So to catch you up, there's this thing that happened with Abraham. So the promise that God made with Abraham when he said, I'm going to make a nation through you, God's people, we're going to work together, came with this caveat. It was a little bit strange because Abraham was an old guy. His wife was quite old. They're well past the age of having kids. So that first part, Abraham's like, really? Like, I'm not going to have kids. It hasn't worked up to this point, God, so why would it happen now? But that was God's promise. So Abraham said, okay, I trust you, which is the first part that was amazing about Abraham's faith, why he became the father of Israel, of this nation, of God's people. But then the other part was, so after all this time, and Abraham does have a son with his wife, Sarah, God then tells him this thing, says, okay, now sacrifice him. Which is alarming, right? Like that's, there's not enough gasps happening here. I think maybe some of you have heard this story before, so you know the ending, but sacrifice your son. One, barbaric, but two, like, you just promised me that I'd have kids, so sacrifice him. In this setting, in ancient Mesopotamia, this wasn't actually as unheard of a thing. There was cults and other religions where child sacrifices happened regularly. This was a first for God to ask for it. This didn't happen with God's people. But Abraham faithfully is like, oh, okay, God, I don't know what you're doing, but sure. Let's try this thing. So Isaac, his son, a little bit older, so they make an altar. He goes to sacrifice him. And even Isaac's like, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says faithfully, like, God's got it. Like, he'll provide something. I don't know what's going to happen here, son, but it's going to go. Tense moment. And he's about to sacrifice his son, and God then says, stop. This was a bit of a test, but it's also a story that I want to see. So you clearly trust me, Abraham. That's fantastic. Yes, your son Isaac here, I'm going to bless him. Through him, there's going to be multitudes of generations for sure. But then God provides a lamb. And this is symbolic of Jesus coming thousands of years later. And why this is such a massive thing is because in an era, in a world where there's these other deities and other powers that be and other ideas and philosophies that we constantly live by that require sacrifice of yourself, of your son, of your stuff, God now is saying there's a story where God provides the sacrifice for us. Amen? It's amazing. This is an amazing thing. This is exactly what all the readers would have heard when they heard children of Abraham. They knew they were part of this story. They would have remembered that they were part of this faith of following God. They would have known then that Jesus was also that sacrifice that God provided. See, we look at fair as this sense of greed of like what I deserve versus what they deserve. But grace is a different statement that God actually operates the world by, that we have a loving God who provides a sacrifice, Jesus Christ, and fulfills that promise to Abraham for all of us. And you can miss that point when you focus on the small details. The Apostle Paul, the author of Galatians, did this regularly. This is what the people in the churches that Paul was writing this aggressive all-caps letter to were doing, is they missed that part. They remembered the genealogy, they knew the rules, they knew the thing, and you got to do the sacrifices and stuff. So Paul actually then goes on in Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. He says, Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles, non-Jewish people, non-religious people at the point, by faith, and announce this very gospel in advance to Abraham. That's what was going on. So he reminds them of that story. All nations will be blessed through you. Just directly quotes Genesis 12 there, something that he would have memorized. But for a long time in Paul's life, he completely missed that point. So this was a humble admission for Paul, somebody who would have grown up as a religious scholar who knew everything. He was a know-it-all. And he persecuted people who didn't know it all. And he says, I missed this part because Scripture literally said it, and I had the things memorized, and I didn't get there. Scripture foresaw this, and I missed that whole point. So then Paul continues on in verse 10. He's saying, here's what happens if you're going to continue to miss the point and you just want to keep going by the rules and the manners and the way you dress and everything. So verse 10, he says, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, this is quoting from Habakkuk, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written by the book of the law. This is a huge theme in Galatians where the Apostle Paul, the author here, is saying, if you decide to just make your life about being a perfect person, go ahead and try that, but you've got to actually be a perfect person. And in fact, what's going to happen? That's not going to happen. He knows it. He calls it out. Not a single person is going to be able to be perfect and sinless. You're going to break the rules. You're going to mess up and slip away, so you need something different. Otherwise, you're going to be under a curse. And here's a way I heard this curse described, because you can think a curse, okay, what a weird term. There's voodoo and like a stick doll. But actually, if you think about this curse as a fence that you start putting up all these signs on to keep people out of saying, like, if you got to follow all of these rules. And ironically, one of my things I've been doing here as a church, as I've gone around, there are signs everywhere that say, do this and put that thing over there, and like, all caps, like, never use this thing. We got signs everywhere. There's a thing that happens with signs is on the back of the sign, it says the same thing to us. So we think we've created a fence that keeps us in and them out by following the rules. Paul says here there's this curse, and the curse is that we're actually on the outside of the fence too when we try to put up these picket signs of rules. So this is a big deal. This is why Paul is trying to attack this. He says it's a huge thing. We think we deserve so much more, but then we don't follow through with the things. There's a sign, I thought it was so perfect. There's a big one, all caps, says, put away all tables immediately downstairs. And I get that because we have all these tables and we do so many events, and there's tables that are out and it's a nightmare, and then I got to pick it up and I'm out of shape and I don't like it, and I know a lot of you have back problems, so we don't like cleaning up tables. But then all of a sudden I noticed that, like, we leave tables out, and then I leave tables out and I justify it because I think it's okay for me. But that sign suddenly doesn't apply, but it actually keeps us out, right? We're so bad at this. Culturally, we use terms in rallies and protests like my God-given rights, and I deserve, and we deserve. And the reality is what's happening here, Paul is saying, no, actually the Bible is saying you deserve to be that sacrifice. You deserve to actually be forgotten about because you're not following the things and you're not perfect. There's a curse. Good thing that God is a God of grace and love and has provided that sacrifice. So think twice before you use statements like what I deserve and what is fair in this world. Daniel 9, a book in the Old Testament, a prophetic book, sums it up well. Daniel, the author, has this lament, this sorrow, because he kind of found himself in the same situation. He thought he was doing everything right, and then has this encounter where God kind of pours out onto his life. So he says, we have sinned and we have done wrong. We have rebelled and turned away, and we forget and we disobey and we act wickedly. Like every single adjective you can think about how we're not doing it right. He says, but you, God, have kept your promise. And that's continued. So Paul continues in Galatians 3, verse 11, quotes Habakkuk again, clearly no one who relies on the law is justified before God because the righteous will live by faith. And what that faith is what Abraham had, is trusting God. Even when stuff doesn't make sense, trusting that God will follow through on his promises. The beautiful thing about the gospel, this message that we talk about here as a church, is it's not about how many good things we can do. It's about trusting that God is better than us, that God follows through on his promises, and that God is present. So why is Paul so heated about all of this? I think we can see it right at the end of this section here in Galatians chapter 3, verse 14, where Paul goes ahead. And he says this thing, and we're going to break it apart a bit. So Galatians 3:14, God has redeemed us in order that the blessing given to Abraham might come to the Gentiles, non-religious people as well, through Jesus Christ, so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. This is hugely important because there's a massive implication here. The order of that statement, that we might receive the Spirit, is implying that if we are not accepting the fact that there is no in and out, and that even though you can follow this lineage of who's in the family and they didn't follow all the rules, but I followed more of the rules, it says if you start thinking that way and you prevent that blessing to be followed through to all nations, for people everywhere to have this opportunity to come and trust in God, to accept Jesus Christ, that might disqualify you from being part of the family too. So Paul is saying this is a big deal, and you have no clue that you keeping people out is keeping yourself out of this. I heard an article that described that every organization and group and community and place of work and families, and for this example, let's think of churches. Church communities have an accent. And not an accent like my brother-in-law is from England, has a beautiful accent. We love it when he talks. It's been years. We still laugh at him. He's got some thick skin because whatever, he says stuff. But an accent that's not quite as spoken, but the way we live and the way we do stuff and the way we, have manners, and we dress this way, and we don't wear hats there, but we wear shoes, this kind of thing, and put the tables away. You unintentionally develop an accent for the way you communicate to other people, and it can become a pretty hard to understand accent. Like the fabric store I was in, had an accent, right? And I could tell, even though we're speaking the same language, we weren't speaking the same language at all. I did not belong there, and I didn't understand the taffeta versus the wovens and denim. I didn't have a clue, right? I didn't know what was going on. But we've got an accent, and it might be somewhere from like kind of backwoods, maybe hickish. It might be really pretentious and snobby and trying to like force a bit of otherworldly sound to it. Not the way we speak, but the way we are. And the temptation of mine was to start thinking of all these different things and fences and signposts that I do in my life, the things that I've put up. But I think the more important thing here is we don't need a list of condemnation. We need a powerful focus instead on God's example of dropping that, being open and inclusive with this idea of Abraham's family and God's blessing through that. Because family is a really powerful example. See, one of our core values at our church here, Cedar Valley, is belong. We say with the question, how am I welcoming people into belonging? How am I welcoming people into this community? And far more than just a handshake, more of like, I care about you deeply as a person. I care about your highs and lows. I care about if you're moving somewhere or you're having a hard time or if your dog is sick. I care, and I want you to care about me, and I want this to be an inclusive community. It's not ethnic-based, it's not religious-based, it's not geographically based or physical or symbolic. It is real. It's a family kind of bond. And I think this is so cool that Paul uses this imagery and metaphor as family, because throughout the Bible, many different biblical authors use different examples to understand what does a church community, what does a faith group, what do the people of God look like. Some authors have used kingdom, which has its application in place, where there's battles and there's allegiance and there's trust and devotion. Some have used a hospital, a place of healing where you come to when you're sick and wounded, you need healing. Some have used a team or a body. We talked about the body of Christ at our annual general meeting. We all have a part to play. We're all valuable and important. But here Paul uses this imagery of family, Abraham's family. And I think it's beautiful because so much of the Bible talks about eating together at the table. And that's the thing. Some of you might have a bad experience with family. Some of you might not have, not your blood family necessarily being your brothers or parents or sisters or cousins, but instead family in the sense like, what I thought was so silly, but if you know the Fast and the Furious movies, family like that movie is actually about family and not cars exploding, but it's mostly cars exploding, and they say like the word family 5 times. Family like who you want to sit down at the dinner table with and have an amazing conversation. Family like who you don't care what's gone on in their day or week. Well, you do really care, but there's nothing that would disqualify them from coming and eating a meal with you. And I think it's so beautiful that so much of the Bible and so much of what Jesus did was eat with people he disagreed with, ate with people who hated him. Because this was an amazing place to come together. It's what you do with family. Even in the Gospel of John, words right from Jesus when people were having this argument of, but I'm a child of Abraham. And Jesus said, you might be a descendant of Abraham, but you're not a child of Abraham. You get to be a child in this family by faith and by allegiance, and that's how you get that opportunity. So here's the way I want to end this with this story of what family looks like and how it applies to us and how we can actually kind of attack and focus on God and try to shut down that what's fair and who's in and who's out and understand what Paul is saying to all of us here. One last story, again, words from Jesus. This is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, where Jesus is sharing a parable, again, a story for us to understand, of what's called the prodigal son. The prodigal son story. In a nutshell, Jesus tells a story of a man who had 2 sons. The younger son told his father one day that he would like his inheritance and to go off and go do all the stuff he wanted to do. Leave the family, get all his money, do the things. Hugely offensive. This was pretty much a slap in the face. The youngest son pretty much giving the middle finger to the dad, saying, I don't care about you. You could die. For all I care, I'm going off to do my own thing. I want to head into the city. So the father, heartbroken clearly, obliges and provides his son with all of this, with the inheritance, and the son takes off. And doesn't give us a timeline, but a little while later, that youngest son had squandered everything he had. He blew it all. He was partying. He had prostitutes, and he's doing whatever, and just completely made a mess of himself. Hit rock bottom. Drugs and alcohol and everything you could think of. He came crawling back. He says he was covered in mud and dirt from pig pens. Couldn't get any lower than this. And here's where the beauty of a gracious and generous God comes in. The love of the Father saw the Son crawling back, disgusting and dirty and muddy, and the Father goes running out with open arms to accept him. And the Son says, how can you do this? I'm not worthy. And the Father just says, I don't care. Let's throw a party for you. So he throws a party, and they celebrate the fact that his Son has come home all night. And it's this beautiful story about God's acceptance, that no matter how far gone you are, it doesn't matter, that God will accept you with open arms. There's a second part to the story that you can miss sometimes. It's the fact that there's another son. There was an older son who was so angry that his dad accepted the younger son back. He said, how can you do this? He has treated you so poorly. He's squandered everything that you're worth, that you gave him, and you're throwing him a party. And the younger son, or the older son, wouldn't even go into the party that the father had thrown. So there's two things here. The first one is that there's an invitation into the family of God, into this faith, accepting the promise that God gave Abraham way back when, gives us now, simply believing that God will follow through on his promise, and that we believe that has been fulfilled through Jesus Christ. So you believe in him, you accept him, and start that relationship. No matter how far gone you think you are, it's not enough to keep God away from having open arms to you. The second part is the older son in this story, the hyper-religious son who followed all the rules and did all the right things, was just as lost as the son who took off and got himself covered in pig poo and everything, lost all his money, hit rock bottom, because he was stuck on the idea of fair and who deserves to be in and who deserves to be out, and got stuck under this idea of, I'm putting up these rules, and the Father said, you've missed the point, and now you're the one who's lost on the outside. Because the whole idea of the gospel, everything that's being communicated here in this passage, what we need to understand about our world is it's not about fair, it's about grace. I read a document about church policies and designs and how you operate a church really well, and this one author said, we actually have a policy where we say our church is not a fair church. We do things that seem unfair, because for one person we might bless them with a really nice gift card, the other one we might have forgotten, but we said thank you. And if you operate by fair, you miss the point. Instead, they said our policy is grace and love, the way that God loves us with grace. We're generous-hearted. We openly accept and talk and reach people, and that's what we need to live by, is not the sense of what's fair, but what's based on grace. So I'm going to pray, and we're going to end there. God, thank you for your message that you have repeated to us so many times here in the Bible of family. God, if we were just living under a sense of what is fair, what we deserve, it would not go well for us. And I know that you give us those understandings, those communications, and those warnings, God, through the Apostle Paul here. You've given us the warning that we can't focus on what is fair and what we deserve, because it won't go well for us. Our perspective is so small. God, thank you that instead you have provided this sense of grace, and that you accept us. If we think we're doing so well, we probably have things that we don't have a clue on, God, but you still accept us. So challenge us to never be a barrier to somebody else who needs that acceptance, God, who needs to be in the family, who is seeking after Jesus, God. Highlight for us ways that we have unintentionally put up barriers. Highlight for us ways that we have kept people out and that we've had thinking of us and them. God, and instead just pour over us and let us reflect your love and your open arms in this world. God, I just pray you bless us as we go this week, God. Give us the strength to interact with our friends and family and neighbors with your love and your truth. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Thank you for joining us, everyone, this week. Have a great week, and God bless.